All right, so today we're tackling a pretty heavy topic, Nick Land's Dark Enlightenment. It's this really complex mix of political theory, economics, and a pretty bleak view of the future. What we're going to do is walk through a source that takes its main claims and really puts them under the microscope, testing them against the actual evidence to see what holds up. Let's get into it.
Our source kicks things off with this quote from Richard Feynman, and it's just the perfect way to frame this whole discussion. The point here isn't to score points or win a debate. It's all about intellectual honesty. It's about being rigorous and really testing ideas, especially the ones we might find appealing, against what the data actually says.
So how do you even begin to fairly evaluate a big, complicated ideology like this? Well, our source uses a really great method called steel manning. You might have heard of straw manning. That's when you attack a weak version of your opponent's argument. Steel manning is the exact opposite. You engage with the strongest, most charitable version of the argument. Only then, if it still doesn't hold up, can you really say you've scrutinized it properly.
Okay, so before we go any further, what is the Dark Enlightenment? In a nutshell, it's an ideology that's deeply critical of modern democracy. It pulls together a few different threads. You've got Hobbesian theory, which basically says human nature is self-interested and competitive. You mix that with Austrian economics and some evolutionary psychology, and the whole thing comes together to argue that systems like democracy and progressivism are fundamentally flawed. Okay, here we go. This is the first major testable claim we're going to look at. The core idea is that democracy is inherently short-sighted. Think about it. Politicians are constantly thinking about the next election, which is only a few years away. So they have this massive incentive to spend money right now on things voters can see and feel, instead of making those tough, smart, long-term investments that might not pay off for decades. And you have to admit, that argument feels pretty intuitive, doesn't it? It kind of makes sense on the surface. But the real question, the only one that matters, is what does the data actually say when we look at how democracies behave all over the world? And this is where it gets really fascinating. The source points to this big 2005 study that found, yeah, this election year spending spree is a real thing, but almost exclusively in new democracies. We're talking about a spending spike of about 1% of GDP, which sounds small, but for a whole country, that is a huge amount of money. But here's the kicker. In well-established democracies, the ones with strong institutions and a free press to keep politicians honest, that effect pretty much vanishes.
This quote from the source just nails the conclusion perfectly. To say democracy is inherently short-sighted is like looking at the first cars, which, yeah, sometimes caught on fire, and concluding that the internal combustion engine is fundamentally a fire-starting machine. The problem isn't a core feature of democracy, it's a bug that happens in its early stages. Over time, mature democracies built institutional fire extinguishers, like a free press and an independent judiciary, that fix the problem.
All right, let's move on to the next big claim. So if democracy is flawed and short-sighted, what's the alternative? The argument goes that a secure autocrat, what some economists call a stationary bandit, can actually do better. The logic is, if a ruler effectively owns the entire country and plans to be there for a long time, they have a direct personal incentive to make the whole pie bigger, to invest for the long term, so they can take a bigger slice later. The classic example everyone points to is Singapore. But again, when you zoom out from single examples and look at all the data, the story completely flips. A really important 2019 study looked at this exact question, and what it found was that on average, when a country becomes a democracy, its GDP per capita grows by about 20 to 25% more over the next quarter century than if it had remained an autocracy.
And there's another really important problem here. The source brings up research showing that you can't always trust the numbers coming out of autocracies. They tend to systematically overstate how well their economies are doing, sometimes by as much as 35%. Without a free press or independent statisticians to call them out, it's way too easy to just cook the books. That makes any direct comparison really, really tricky. So this all comes down to a classic logical fallacy, selection bias. It is really easy to hold up Singapore as a shining example. But for every one Singapore, how many disastrous failures are there? Places like Zaire or Venezuela or Myanmar. You just can't judge an entire system by cherry-picking its one big success story while completely ignoring the huge pile of failures. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears. Up to this point, we've been looking at claims we can actually test with data. But now the analysis is moving into something much broader, a more all-encompassing ideological framework that is absolutely central to the Dark Enlightenment. And that framework is known as the cathedral.
The idea here is that all of our major institutions, we're talking universities, the media, the government bureaucracy, they all act like a single self-organizing entity. And their purpose, whether they know it or not, is to promote and enforce a progressive worldview, no matter who's actually elected.
Now, before we dig into the cathedral, we need to pull out a really important tool from the philosophy of science. It's called falsifiability. It's a simple but powerful idea from the philosopher Karl Popper. He said that for any theory to be considered scientific, there has to be some kind of observation you could make that would prove it wrong. If there's no way to possibly prove it false, then it's just not science.
And this is exactly where, according to our source, the whole cathedral theory just completely falls apart. It's built as a perfect, self-sealing logic loop. Look at this. If you find evidence that contradicts the theory, well, that's just proof that the cathedral is suppressing the truth. If most people disagree with the theory, that's just proof of how powerful its ideological capture is. And if, on the rare occasion, you find some evidence that seems to support it, well, that's just a truth finally breaking through. See the problem? Any and every outcome is seen as confirmation. It's a thought-terminating circle.
So let's pull all of this together. After going on this whole evidence-based journey, what have we actually found? Well, a really clear pattern starts to emerge when you look at the different kinds of arguments being made. This table really sums up the source's verdict beautifully. You can basically sort the arguments into two big buckets. On one side, you have the specific testable claims, like the one about short-term spending. And yeah, there's often a little grain of truth there, but it's usually based on cherry-picked data or it's a specific case that's been misapplied to the whole system. But then you have the second bucket, these huge, untestable frameworks like the cathedral. And those, the source argues, are structured just like pseudoscience. They're designed to be completely immune to any kind of empirical evidence. So, what are the big lessons to take away from all this? First and foremost, it's so important to be able to tell the difference between a claim you can actually test and an ideology you just have to take on faith. The evidence is pretty clear. On average, democracies do better economically than autocracies. And the problems we see in democracies? They're usually not fatal flaws, but bugs that we can often fix with smarter, better-designed institutions.
And that brings us to the final provocative question the source leaves us with, and it really gets to the heart of everything we've talked about. Do you want to be right, or do you want to feel right? The whole process of science is about being willing to be proven wrong in the search for what's actually true. But ideology is often about the comfort of feeling like you already have the answers, no matter what the evidence says. And really, that's a choice every one of us has to make when we look at the world.